people on board, 276 people made it to shore. That's remarkable. But that was dangerous. And then if we just dip into chapter 28, Paul's bitten by this poisonous serpent, poisonous snake. And then eventually being a prisoner for an extended period of time in Rome had its own unique dangers. So we kind of lump all of these together to remind ourselves that in addition to all the things Paul had experienced in the past, this voyage to Rome was fraught with danger. And yet, and I think this is why the details are here. This is why it's explained in such a specific way. Paul makes it. And we know, because we're told, because Paul was told, the reason he makes it is because God said he was going to make it. Now we're going to get back to that as we work through the chapter. But this, I think, frames our study. It is very dangerous. The details are there to explain how dangerous it was. But God said, Paul, you're going to make it. Let's get back into our reading of the chapter. And we'll pick up a couple of details about the storm and resume in verse 21 where Paul addresses the folks on board here. So let me advance to our map again. And we're picking back up right here. This part of the journey has been difficult. Luke says so. And so they made this adjustment, and then when they're under the lee of the island of Crete, or they are under some protection from the wind on that side of the island, they get the lifeboat or the small rowboat. They get that on board. They run the ropes around the hull of the ship. They throw over some unnecessary furniture or tack or equipment or something that maybe they didn't necessarily have to have, and they took these measures. So as they depart from Fair Havens, remember, Paul had made what suggestion? Before they left Fair Havens, Paul made the suggestion, I don't think it's a good idea to go any farther. And we asked last week, why is Paul interjecting himself into this? Why is, someone who is, a landlubber and he's not a sailor, he's not one of the crew, why does he step forward and say, hey, what are we doing here? This is not a good idea. And I offered at least the suggestion last week that when you've been shipwrecked 3 times already, you have a voice. You will not be silenced. And especially, he says in 2 Corinthians 11 that I spent a day and night in the deep and I don't want to do that again. Well, he didn't say I don't want to do that again, but I think we can infer Paul had no desire to repeat that experience if it's avoidable. So the map shows that, while all they were trying to do is go west to this more suitable port for the winter, they were driven, and then from this island of Clauda or Cauda, depending on how you pronounce it, they began to experience a very violent storm, or continue to experience the violent storm. I wanted to pick back up with verse 17 for just a minute. So after hoisting it up, that is the little boat that was being towed behind the ship, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. And terms are not easy to translate. You might have something just a little bit different if you're reading from the King James or American Standard. But the bottom line is they were taking drastic measures because of their fears of just being driven out of control. And their fear, as stated here, was being run aground on the Syrtis. I pointed out, and you can see on the chart last week how far this is, where they are from. But they figure if they are just driven with the wind, they are going to get into an area along the coast of the northern part of Africa there, near what would be modern-day Libya. They're going to get into an area that's just extremely treacherous and difficult to navigate. Now, I highlight that because I have a couple of quotations on the handout that I think are very interesting about this matter. And I'll read one of them because of the references to ancient secular writers. And this points out, number one, when Luke makes this statement, it is authentic as it can be. That this was in the minds of sailors, because this is in the minds of sailors who would try to navigate the Mediterranean in this ancient time. And these secular sources just corroborate this. So, the ancient writer Pliny, there's Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, the one that writes natural history, said, and this is 1st century, this area had a horrible reputation as a sailor's graveyard. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, says that the name alone struck terror in those that heard it. So here are secular sources that identify the same area and identify the same kind of fear. It was such a very difficult place to navigate, and it was known as a sailor's graveyard. And the sailors on this ship in Acts chapter 27 knew that we are heading in that general direction if we don't do something. And so they took a number of drastic measures to try to at least be driven more diagonally, or as much as they can, fighting the wind all along, instead of just running with it and going so far southwest that they would be in a very treacherous area along the coast of North Africa. So what do they choose to do? They choose to fight against it, and it just puts them farther away from land. But they're holding on hope that somehow they can weather the storm and then navigate to some safe place. But here's what we learn, and we ended in this general neighborhood last Sunday morning. Verse 20 says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of being saved was at last abandoned. That means they think they're going down. They don't know where they are because they can't navigate. They haven't seen the sun or the stars. They're not sure exactly which direction they've gone in or where they're at. And that equals, we can't spend too much time in the ocean like this. So it may be that the boat was leaking. They've gone to these measures to try to bind up the hull, and it's probably creaking, and it's just a very treacherous experience. So we pick up with verse 21 and Paul addressing those on board. Since they had been without food for a long time. Now, why is that any kind of significant detail? does that in some way tell us kind of the mood on board? Because if people are going to do anything, what are they going to do? They're going to eat. Way beyond hangry, right? And so it gives us this feeling, which I think all of these details do. First of all, there was no time for supper. You know, it's like, guys, let's just take a break. They're fighting against the weather, just trying to keep the ship, trying to navigate it, trying to keep from being driven with the wind. And they're doing this every minute, 24/7. And so it is a very extremely taxing matter. So there's no time for a break. And you might think, well, tomorrow's going to be better. Tomorrow's going to be better. And on this went for 2 weeks. So this detail is not just incidental. It gives us a feeling about how bad it was on the ship. Rocking and rolling, trying to survive, and all of that. So Paul knew the mood on the ship, how everybody felt. And Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and have not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." There's always one in the crowd, right? I told you so. Is that what Paul's doing? What do you think Paul's doing here? Yeah, that's right. Another danger, being thrown overboard. Right. What's his point? Is there any point other than I told you so? Well, what about Paul has more advice to give. And this you would suppose, lend credibility. He said, I'm going to try this again. I'm going to try to offer some guidance again. And based upon their previous conversations, I think Paul is trying to suggest you really should listen to what I'm saying. And you see Paul's credibility growing and growing as you get to the end, to the point where the centurion is more inclined to listen to Paul than anybody else. So he has this now to say. And what he has to say now might be more difficult to believe what he had said before. Before it was like, maybe anybody could see this. We've been fighting this weather. Maybe it's not a good idea to leave Fair Havens. It's getting to be a very dangerous time to keep going. Now he wants to tell them what an angel said. So to maybe strengthen his case, he says, in essence, what I've already offered, what I've already said came true. Now, here's a word of encouragement. This very night, there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and of whom I worship, and whom I worship. And he said, "Fear not, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you." So Paul then, based on that, says, "So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island." Now let's just dwell on what Paul says here. for a few minutes. He receives a direct revelation from God through this angel of God who's delivering a message. And the message is, don't be afraid. You must stand before Caesar. Now, this is a very interesting example, and we won't camp on this, but I do think it's a very interesting example of something we call necessary inference. What is that? A necessary inference is a logical conclusion that necessarily follows from the information in the text. Sometimes people have cast necessary inference as some type of guess or whatever. We talk about it with reference to all kinds of doctrinal issues or worship or various things as we try to appreciate everything that the text says. The angel did not say, apparently, Paul, you're not going to drown in the Mediterranean Sea. Didn't say that. But is that implied? Yes. It's not implied because of guesswork, or rather I should say, we don't infer that by guesswork. It is implied in what the angel actually said. If he's going to stand before Caesar, then he's got to survive this. And Paul understood that logical connection. And we see this all the time in the Bible. We see the matter of drawing rational conclusions based on the evidence. And that's not using human logic or some kind of guesswork. It is a matter that is embedded into the matter of logical communication as God created it. And so Paul makes the inference. He's going to survive. But not only that, this is what he's told. And I think this is a beautiful thing, don't you? And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. God has granted you. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What has Paul been praying the last 14 days? I think we can at least reasonably assume Paul has not gone 2 weeks without praying. And he might have prayed something like, Father, be with the sick and be with those who are traveling. We're traveling. Be with us. Or maybe even something more clear and real. But the angel says what? Look at the language. God has given you. Paul could have been the only one that survived and still got to Rome. God still would have been faithful to the promise, you must stand before Caesar. But God has given you, Paul, all of these people. That's a beautiful thing, isn't it? I also think, and maybe this caught your attention too, that when Paul says that this very night before me an angel of God appeared to me, he says, an angel of the God to whom I belong. What a thoughtful statement. He is the God to whom I belong. I think all Christians should aspire to make that real in their lives. He is the God to whom I belong, whom I serve. All right, so this is what he communicates, and then his exhortation is in verse 25. Take heart, men. For I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. Don't you love that part? And you have to, again, don't forget the scene in the background with the wind blowing and the rain blowing and up and down, and we're going to be fine. And it's like, it doesn't look like that. And this comes right on the heels of Luke saying, we had all abandoned any hope. One thing we don't read here is Paul on the deck of the ship saying, peace, be still. And then saying, did y'all see that? And it's all calm and everything. And now that I got your attention, that didn't happen. He told them, we're going to survive. We're going to have to run this ship aground. The ship's going to be lost, but God has granted all the lives. And I believe in God. I believe it will happen exactly as I've been told. And yet from the mere observation of the circumstances, it does not seem very likely that the 276 people on board are all going to make it through this alive. But Paul said, what? I have faith in God. And it will happen exactly as it was told to me. That's fascinating. Now, I think that this, verse 25, is what we could call the key verse in this chapter. In this whole section, this voyage to Rome. Paul's having to go through the storm too. He's having to go through the dangers too. He's not been isolated from all kinds of harm. And it would be easy to believe the worst. But in spite of the way things are going, in spite of the circumstances and how hopeless it appears, I believe in God. And it's going to happen just like He said. And so it does happen like God says. So you and I, as we read this, we are encouraged as Christians to see the development of the church in those early years down to Paul's trip to Rome. And it is extremely, extremely dangerous. It gets to the point nobody thinks they're going to make it. But Paul stands up and says, yes, we're going to make it because God said so. And this is at the heart of what this book is about. Jesus said, I'm going to empower you. And you are going to be my witnesses. In Jerusalem and Judea, wait, it looks like the church is going to be wiped out. The persecution, it looks like the church is going to be wiped out. No, you're going to be my witnesses. From Jerusalem, Judea, to Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. It may be, as people are going to the uttermost parts of the earth, they think they're going to drown. They're going to get there. If I say they're going to get there. And this is in a verse, a statement as to why the church succeeded. Why? Because God was behind it. This is God's plan. This is God's doing. And He's going to see to it. That doesn't mean people don't have hard times. It doesn't mean people are not at times suffering or even killed. But Paul knows this is going to happen. The saving of everyone's life. Going to Rome because God said so. So you might even want to circle this verse, verse 25, and identify it as a key moment. I think giving us insight as to why all these details are here to tell us how dangerous this was. It's because the success in the end was due to the promise of God. So verse 27 then continues the account as they're getting close to land. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven along the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So, did they hear the surf? Did something capture their attention? So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. As I explained in the handout, the word sounding here has nothing to do with sounds you hear. It's just a completely different term. And it has to do with dropping a lead weight on a rope and measuring the depth. They measured the depth, then a little while later they measured the depth again, and it's shallower, and it doesn't take a smart sailor to know we're getting closer to land. And so they measured first 20 fathoms. A fathom was about 6 feet, or the distance a man could stretch his arms out. So you could imagine taking the rope and stretching it out as they put it over and counting, and they would have then an estimation of the depth. They did so, did it again, found out it was more shallow than their first measurement, and fearing they might run on the rocks or might run aground in the dark, they let 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. That's a detail that I imagine Luke and the others, as they look back upon this later, said, I remember that moment. Just to stop our approach to the shore, we threw the anchors out the back and just hoped we made it through the night. What if the anchors pull loose? What if the ropes break? What if the tension is so strong that the anchors don't hold? You could have 1,000 scary thoughts through the night. And they hoped or prayed for day to come. So verse 30 says, as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, hey, we better go check something. Paul knew what they were up to. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. One thing we might think about is the fact that they're not done. The plan was everyone can be saved and the ship will run aground. And they're needed to navigate the ship the rest of the way to the shore. Well, be that as it may, Paul makes this statement. And so this is not just an incidental detail. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. They're finally listening to somebody, aren't they? How far they have come since they left Crete, when Paul was just chirping in and, as a prisoner, just ignored. But things are changing now in the mood on the ship and how they view Paul and his guidance. And so the soldiers cut those ropes and prevent that boat from being used as an escape. So we read in verse 33, as day was about to come, Paul urged them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day you've continued in suspense without food and have taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food. It will give you strength. Right? They're going to have to abandon ship here at some point. And so, he promises them not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. When he had said these things, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So up until now, they had thrown out everything that they could do without, but hoping to still preserve the cargo. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Alexandria, Egypt, was a major supplier of grain to Rome. And these ships would run usually in the sailing season twice a year. So this may very well be a second trip. And in Myra, where they change ships and find the ship going to Rome from Alexandria, ancient granaries have been discovered in that region as well. Again, every little detail that Luke shares that can be checked out is just found to be exactly correct. Okay, we're not surprised at that, but we are amazed how many details are here. So they throw the wheat into the sea. When it was day, they did not recognize the land. This would not be where sailors would probably recognize the land as opposed to a used harbor on a different part of the island. But they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors, left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. This gives us a detail about the ancient ships. Don't think of, a big pirate ship with the wheel and the rudder in the rear of the boat, but these are probably giant oars that would be let down into the back to steer in that fashion, and one on each side. So they untied these exterior rudders so that they could steer the boat towards the beach. And the text says, then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. The ESV says, but striking a reef. That's probably taken some liberties here. Others texts say sandbars. The Greek is literally a place where the two oceans met, meaning nothing more than a shallow spot. They hit a shallow spot, whatever the actual structure was under the surface of the ocean. They hit a shallow spot, meaning the seafloor would become shallow very fast, creating severe surf. And maybe with the storm and the wind, it's more severe. The text says the bow of the boat stuck and remained immovable, and they were stuck right there at the most dangerous part, that is, in the severe surf. And so the stern, the rear of the boat, was being torn apart. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. Now I want you to camp on that for just a minute. What did the centurion do? He said no. He kept them from carrying out their plan. What if the centurion had been of a different frame of mind? Now, the text goes on to say those that could swim jumped in, those that could not held on to some planks or pieces of the ship, and they all made it safely to land. I want to ask this question. Think about what the centurion did and other details. Where's the miracle? Okay. That's true. Let's think about miracle in a biblical, defined way. Nobody walks on water. Nobody's raised from the dead. Now, there is a miracle. The angel appears to Paul and says, what? You're going to make it. So there's a miracle or a divine revelation, a direct divine revelation through the angel. But there are still waves. There's still gravity. There's still debris. There's still the soldiers. God's involved. They had to eat for strength. There's all kinds of natural things going on. But I think what we do see here that we want to honor and respect is we see the providence of God at work. We see God making it happen, but He can make it happen without a miracle. That's what's amazing. Is that from any, spectator from a distance, they just see, oh, these people were lucky. It's not like anybody said, peace be still, like Jesus did on the Sea of Galilee. Nobody walked on the water to the shore. There was no miracle, but God made it happen. And that ought to comfort any Christian. Again, when we understand the very limited use of miracles in the ministry of Jesus and the apostles and the specific role they played, let's not think God's hands are tied because He no longer works that way. If God says it, if God is behind it, He doesn't need a miracle to make it happen. And so we can appreciate that in terms of God achieving His plan. And His plan was to have Paul arrive in Rome. All right. We'll pick up and continue our study. And it won't be long before we conclude the book of Acts. One more chapter to go.